few months ago, I gave a talk in Columbia, Tennessee at the James K. Polk home. And I've gotten to know the director fairly well over the years of my research on Polk. And in introducing me for the talk, he said, I went through Walt's books, 1812, the French and Indian War, Alaska, and I was kind of trying to figure out how he got to Polk. And then it hit me. It was Western expansion. And, I must confess that he was right, that the theme of Western expansion is really the overriding theme of all of my work on American history. So it's kind of natural to go from 1812, which I say sort of set up the next generation of Western expansionism, and focus on James K. Polk, who certainly by any standard was a pretty major expansionist president. That said, within my biography of Polk, I think there are probably four themes that moved me to write the book and moved me to really delve into who Polk was. And some of them have been explored, and some of them I don't think have been explored as much as maybe they deserve to be. The first one is really Polk's relationship with Andrew Jackson. Jackson really was Polk's mentor on a whole variety of things. Western expansionism perhaps is the most important, but whether it was the bank issues or domestic policy or other things, Jackson really guides Polk's career. And I think the two things that maybe jump out the most of that relationship is that it's really Jackson who summons Polk to the Hermitage in May of 1844, when the Democratic Party is just sort of in chaos as to who's going to be the nominee, because Martin Van Buren, who's sort of always been the presumptive nominee at that point, has just infuriated Jackson over his opposition to the annexation of Texas. Well, Polk, of course, is very much in favor of the annexation of Texas, and Old Hickory knows that he can really count on Polk to carry through with that. So what happens is that Polk summons Jackson, or Polk is summoned by Jackson to the Hermitage, and a few weeks later at Baltimore, the Democrats nominate him. Now, the second thing that is sort of overlooked in that relationship is that as Polk gets into the campaign of 1844, it's really Jackson who comes to his rescue on a very particular point. And that is John Tyler. John Tyler, you'll remember, is still president of the United States in 1844. He'd like to be president again, even though neither major party renominated him. But Tyler is still in the battle at that point by August of 1844, when Polk just sort of throws up his hands and goes to Old Hickory and says, look, you're the only man in the country who can really get Tyler out of this race. And getting Tyler out of this race is really a key part of my being able to beat the Whig, Henry Clay, and win the presidency, and of course make good to you all of this Western expansionism that we both talked about over our careers for the last 20 years. So that's the first theme, the closeness of Polk and Andrew Jackson. The second theme is this whole idea that Polk is a dark horse. I read in the Wall Street Journal just the other day a review of another book that characterized Polk as a dark horse. And, I don't really think that that's the case. And I've examined it fairly carefully over his entire career. Here's a man who spent 7 terms in Congress, 2 of them as Speaker of the House of Representatives. He's been governor of Tennessee, albeit he did lose 2 re-election attempts, which is kind of an interesting part of the story and interesting part of the book. But as a dark horse, he really does not fit the mold of what later characterizations came to apply that term to. He really is someone who's a politician, lifelong from his early days in the Tennessee state legislature. And even though he very, I think, humbly said a number of times during the campaign of 1844, thank you for summoning me to the office, and I'm very grateful for the nomination. I didn't expect the nomination, all of those things. The truth of the matter is, I think the record in his own writing and correspondence really bears out that he did indeed intend at some point in his career to be president of the United States. You know, he tried very hard to become the vice presidential nominee in 1840, and let me just leave you on that theme by suggesting that who in American history has ever been satisfied with the vice presidency? Not very many folks. So I think Polk always intended to be president, and it doesn't really square with this dark horse label. Well, the third theme is really the campaign of 1844. How absolutely tumultuous and close this campaign was, and how important it was to the rest of the development of the United States. Henry Clay, the Whig nominee in 1844, has said, Oregon, well, you know, maybe in the next generation. I'm not too interested in acquiring Oregon. Henry Clay has said, Texas? No, I don't think that we ought to acquire Texas, at least not if it's going to cause any friction with Mexico. And Henry Clay hadn't even thought about California. But once Polk is elected, all three of those places, Oregon, California, and Texas, of course, very rapidly come under the Union. And in acquiring those territories, Polk really almost doubles the size of the United States. So the election of 1844 is really tremendously important to the country. And I guess the point of the election is that it's terribly close. 5,000 votes in New York State is all that tips the balance in New York to Polk and away from Henry Clay, and it's the margin of New York's electoral votes that elects Polk over Henry Clay. So I think there's a real strong theme there and an interesting analysis of, again, a pivotal election in American history and how closely fought it was and what it meant to the future of the country. Well, the fourth and final theme that sort of runs through the entire book is presidential leadership and what Polk really did to greatly expand the executive powers of the presidency. You know, when I got started with this project, I said, you know, Polk is really the most aggressive, the most dynamic president between Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln. Now, think about that for a moment and remember some of those names that are on both sides of Polk between Jackson and Lincoln, and you might say, well, gosh, he didn't have very much competition. Well, by the time I got done with my research and writing the book, I was really saying that Polk, in many respects, was a far more aggressive chief executive, greatly expanded the presidency's powers, even far beyond his mentor, Andrew Jackson. You know, Jackson gets a lot of credit for being the swaggering general at the Battle of New Orleans and a number of things that he did in Florida after that. But by the time Jackson occupies the White House, I think he's really mellowed on a number of fronts for a number of reasons we could say. But Polk really comes in with all guns blazing, not only in terms of acquiring the territories we just talked about, but also being a very hands-on manager. Polk really treats his cabinet as a board of directors of a modern corporation, delegating tasks to them, doing tasks himself when he's not sure that the delegation is going to be carried out as he would have it. A very hands-on manager and a very hands-on chief executive. And probably the most important example of that is with the war powers. And again, the parallel could be drawn to Abraham Lincoln. In the early years of the Civil War, Lincoln is really kind of ready to defer to people like Winfield Scott, who I guess you could say that might be natural since Scott had been around so long. But other folks like a young General George McClellan, Lincoln at least gives them a chance. Polk, some 15 years before this, has really dictated to his generals, Zachary Taylor and still Winfield Scott's been around at that point, and of course been around since the War of 1812. Polk really dictates military strategy to them. It doesn't help matters that Polk's the ardent Democrat and both Taylor and Scott are Whigs. But he really does force on them the executive powers of the presidency. And of course, in the bigger picture of wanting to declare war, he's the first president remember that James Madison in the War of 1812 really wrung his hands and said, well, you know, I'm not sure what I should do. I'm going to lay the facts before Congress, let Congress debate whether or not we can go ahead and declare war. But Polk really presents a fait accompli to Congress and says a state of war exists, and here's what we're going to do to execute it. So I think that those four themes were certainly some of the fun points of my working with this book and writing it. And so it becomes Polk, the man who changed the presidency and America. And I hope you enjoy it.